At 28,000 feet, there are no police. There are no judges. There are no witnesses. There is only the wind, the screaming cold, and the story the survivor chooses to tell. On August 2, 2008, two men stood shoulder to shoulder on the summit of K2, the peak climbers call the Savage Mountain. They were friends. They were roped together against the void. But within hours, that bond would be severed in the most brutal way imaginable. By nightfall, one of them would be gone, swallowed by the ice. The other would descend to tell the world a tale of tragedy and heroism, a story the world believed for years. But up here, where the air is too thin to sustain life, the truth dies harder than people do. Years after the disaster, new evidence began to whisper a darker reality. Was the survivor a hero who risked everything to save his friend? Or was he a man who, when faced with the impossible choice between loyalty and life, chose himself and lied to cover the tracks? This is not just a story about a climbing accident. This is the anatomy of a lie told at the ceiling of the world. Welcome to the K2 Stories. Before we ascend into the death zone, if you want to uncover the true untold history of high-altitude mountaineering, make sure to subscribe to K2 Stories. We go where others turn back. To understand the tragedy, you have to understand the man who lived to tell it. Marco Confortola liked to say he didn't just climb mountains, he was made of them. Born in the thin, biting air of Valferva, Italy, Marco was climbing before he could properly read. The narrative fit him like a tailored suit. The boy raised among glaciers, destined for greatness. He wasn't just an enthusiast. He was alpine royalty in the making. While other teenagers were navigating high school drama, Marco was navigating crevasses. He boasted that he became a certified mountain guide at 18. Earning the coveted IFMGA badge qualification that usually takes decades of suffering to achieve. Earning that badge in the Alps is a trial by fire and ice. Candidates are thrown into whiteouts, forced to perform complex rescues while freezing, and made to bivouac on exposed ridges, with nothing but their wits. Most wash out. Marco didn't just pass, he dominated. By his 20s, he was working with the Alpine Rescue Service of Lombardy. Understand what this means. These are the men who fly up when everyone else is running down. They are the ones who arrive when the disaster has already happened, often tasked not with saving lives, but with carrying broken bodies home. Marco built his identity on this grim competence. He claimed to have climbed Grand Zebra nearly 300 times. Whether that number was inflated or not didn't matter. In the valley, he was the expert. He was the hero, and he was about to take that unshakable confidence to the one place on earth that doesn't care how good you are, the Himalayas. The Alps, for all their jagged beauty, are civilized mountains. There are rescue helicopters, cell phone signals, and warm beds in the valleys below. For a man like Marco Confortola, whose ambition grew faster than his list of summits, Europe became too small. He needed a stage where the stakes were absolute, where a mistake didn't mean a rescue, it meant a memorial. In the early 2000s, he turned his gaze east, toward the crushing grandeur of the Himalayas. This is where the story begins to shift from a biography of a talented climber to a study in the malleability of truth. In 2004, Marco announced his intention to climb Everest from the north side, via Tibet. This is the colder, windier, more desolate route. The approach involves crossing the vast, brown expanse of the Tibetan Plateau before reaching the mountain's foot at 17,000 feet in altitude, where most unacclimatized people would already be fainting. The crux of this route is the North Col and the Northeast Ridge, a jagged spine of rock and ice exposed to the full fury of the jet stream. Marco's ascent required navigating the infamous 3 steps, geological hurdles of limestone that guard the summit. The second step is the most notorious, a vertical cliff at over 28,000 feet, surmounted only by an old, terrifyingly loose aluminum ladder left by a Chinese team in 1975. Imagine climbing a ladder that sways over an 8,000-foot drop, while your brain is starving for oxygen, screaming for you to lie down and sleep. Marco claimed he stood on the summit at 29,032 feet. More impressively, he claimed he did it without supplemental oxygen. In the mountaineering world, this is the difference between a standard marathon and running a marathon while breathing through a straw. But when he returned to Italy, the reception was mixed. The newspapers cheered, but the climbing fraternity whispered. Those who saw him at base camp noted that he looked suspiciously fresh for a man who had just spent hours in the death zone without gas. There were no summit photos, no independent witnesses, just his word. Marco shrugged off the skepticism with the arrogance of a man who believes his own legend. But a pattern was emerging. 2 years later, in 2006, Marco attempted Annapurna, the deadliest of all 8,000-meter peaks. He climbed with the legendary Silvio Montanelli. Marco recounted an epic saga of battling falling rocks and exhaustion to stand on the peak. But expedition notes and fellow climbers remembered it differently. They recalled that while Montanelli pushed to the true summit, Marco, exhausted and lagging, had stopped at a false Samita point, roughly 40 minutes below the top. Yet, by the time the story traveled back to Italy, that 40-minute gap had evaporated. In Marco's retelling, the almost became a did. It suggests a psychology where the line between what happened and what should have happened blurs. He wasn't necessarily lying in a malicious sense. Perhaps he was editing reality to fit the persona he had so carefully constructed. While Marco was polishing his image in the Italian press, a very different kind of climber was forging his own path, thousands of miles away. Gerard McDonnell, known to everyone as Ger, was an anomaly. He wasn't born in the shadow of a glacier. He was born in Ireland, a land of rolling green hills and rain, not death zones. He was an engineer, a man of logic, structure, and immense warmth. During the Celtic Tiger economic boom, when most young Irish professionals were chasing wealth in Dublin, Ger moved to Alaska. He went for the work, but he stayed for the wild. Over 5 years, the Alaskan wilderness transformed him. The clean-shaven suit-wearing engineer vanished behind a thick, unruly beard, and a mane of hair that earned him the nickname Jesus. But the nickname wasn't just about the hair, it was about his presence. In a sport dominated by ego, Ger was pure heart. He was the guy who played the bodhrán, a traditional Irish drum in base camp, to lift spirits during storms. He was the one who checked your harness twice. He didn't climb to conquer, he climbed to connect. In 2003, Ger joined an Irish expedition to Everest's south side. It was a brutal awakening. The Khumbu Icefall, the western qualm the lots face every step, was a lesson in suffering. Ger didn't hide his struggle. He admitted the cold terrified him. He admitted the altitude wrecked him, but he kept moving. When he summited on May 26th, his reaction wasn't a roar of victory. It was a quiet, overwhelming wave of gratitude. He spent his time on the roof of the world thanking the Sherpas, recognizing that he was standing on their shoulders. For Ger, the summit wasn't a tick on a list. It was a testament to human cooperation. Everest proved he could survive the altitude, but it was K2 that called to his soul. K2 is not like Everest. Everest is a commercial highway compared to the technical, vertical nightmare of K2. It is a pyramid of sheer steepness, prone to rockfall and avalanches that wipe the face clean. In 2006, fresh off a success on Broad Peak, Ger went to K2 for the first time. He was strong, acclimatized, and ready. But K2 is capricious. High on the mountain, the randomness of the place struck. A rock, dislodged by the wind or melting ice, came hurtling down the face. It wasn't a pebble, it was a missile. Ger saw it coming. There's a specific, sickening sound a rock makes when it cuts through thin air, a low hum that turns into a whistle. There was nowhere to hide. The rock smashed into his helmet, fracturing it and driving the impact into his skull. In an instant, the dream was over. He was concussed, bleeding, and stranded in the lethal cold. His teammates, Mick Murphy and Banjo Bannon, watched the impact. The rescue that followed was a desperate race against cerebral edema. They managed to coordinate a helicopter evacuation, a feat that is statistically unlikely to succeed at that altitude. As the blades chopped the thin air and lifted him off the savage mountain, most men would have made a vow: never again. The pain, the fear, the proximity to the voidage should have been enough to send him back to a desk job in Anchorage. But Ger was built differently. As he recovered, first in a Pakistani hospital and then home in Alaska, the trauma didn't curdle into fear. It hardened into resolve. He told friends that the accident hadn't dissuaded him, it had motivated him. He felt he had unfinished business. It wasn't a death wish, it was a life wish. He wanted to prove that the mountain hadn't beaten him. So, the stage was set for 2008. The season was shaping up to be crowded, chaotic, and dangerous. Teams from South Korea, the Netherlands, Norway, and independent climbers were converging on the Abruzzi Spur. Among them were two men: Marco Confortola, the Italian guide with a history of flexible truths and a hunger for glory, and Gerard McDonnell, the Irish engineer with a mended skull and a heart too big for the death zone. They met during the long, boring days of acclimatization, in the weeks of waiting for weather windows, playing cards, and drinking tea. A friendship formed. It was an unlikely pairing, the intense Media-savvy Italian and the gentle, bearded Irishman. But at base camp, stripped of titles and accolades, everyone is just a fragile bag of water and bone waiting for permission to go up. Marco was drawn to Ger's light. Ger was likely drawn to Marco's confidence. They agreed to coordinate their summit push. July ended, and August began. The weather reports showed a brief, tantalizing window of clear skies. The camp buzzed with nervous energy. Equipment was checked. Oxygen bottles were weighed. Prayers were said. On August 1st, 2008, the swarm began to move. Looking up from base camp, the line of climbers looked like a pilgrimage of ants marching toward the heavens. But as they ascended past Camp 4, entering the final deadly phase of the climb, the cracks in the plan were already beginning to show. Delays, misplaced ropes, and congestion were eating up precious time. The mountain was quiet, waiting. Marco and Ger were climbing toward the bottleneck roped to their destiny, unaware that the ice above them was essentially a loaded gun, pointed directly at their heads. The tragedy had already begun. They just didn't know it yet. The bottleneck on K2 is a geological trap. It is a narrow couloir of ice and rock, rising vertically toward the summit ridge, overshadowed by a massive hanging glacier known as a serac. This serac is a building-sized block of unstable ice that leans out over the climbers like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. To climb K2, you must walk directly beneath it for hours. There is no other way. On August 1st, 2008, this trap was set, and 18 climbers were walking right into its jaws. The plan was simple: fix ropes early, move fast, summit by noon, and get the hell out of the death zone before the sun dipped. But high-altitude mountaineering is rarely simple. As Marco Confortola and Gerard McDonnell arrived at the base of the bottleneck, the machinery of the expedition began to grind to a halt. The advance team, responsible for fixing the safety lines, had made a critical error. The ropes had been planted too low, starting where the terrain was easy and running out exactly where it became deadly. This mistake triggered a chain reaction of delays. Climbers stalled. The bottleneck lived up to its name. Dozens of people from different teams, Koreans, Norwegians, Dutch, Sherpas, were forced into a congested queue, hacking at the ice, improvising anchors, and burning precious oxygen while standing still. Standing still at 27,000 feet is dying. The body, starved of oxygen, begins to shut down non-essential functions. Fingers and toes go numb. The mind drifts. Logic blurs. It was here that Gerard McDonnell found himself staring down his demons. 2 years prior, a rock had nearly killed him on this mountain. Now, he was back in the line of fire, waiting as the hours ticked away. Noon came and went. 1 p.m., 2 p.m. The turnaround time, the safety deadline to descend, was ignored by almost everyone. The summit fever had taken hold. It is a powerful narcotic pull. When you are that close to the top of the world, the rational brain surrenders to the desire to finish. Marco and Gerard pushed on. They moved through the traverse, past the hanging serac, and onto the final summit snowfield. The sun began its descent, casting long jagged shadows across the Karakoram range. It was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a closing coffin lid. At approximately 7 p.m. nearly sunset, Marco Confortola and Gerard McDonnell stepped onto the summit of K2. They had done it. For Marco, it was another jewel in his crown, a validation of his prowess. For Gerard, it was something deeper, a spiritual exorcism of the trauma that had haunted him. They embraced. They took photos, their faces hidden behind oxygen masks and goggles, giving tired thumbs-ups to the camera. But the celebration was hollow. The temperature was plummeting toward 40 below. The wind was picking up, and they were climbing on borrowed time. They began their descent in the twilight. The group was strung out, a line of exhausted figures stumbling down the ridge. Marco and Gar were near the back. Ahead of them, the tragedy had already been triggered. At 8:30 p.m., disaster struck. In the darkness, the massive serac above the bottleneck finally gave way. It wasn't a total collapse, but a shearing off a chunk of ice the size of a house broke free and thundered down the couloir. The violence was absolute. It swept away a Norwegian climber, Rolf Bay, instantly killing him in front of his wife, Cicely Skog. But the ice did something else, something arguably worse for the survivors. It severed the fixed ropes. The lifeline was gone. Marco and Gerard reached the top of the bottleneck to find chaos. The ropes that had guided them up were now useless strands dangling over the abyss. Below them, the darkness was absolute. Without ropes, descending the bottleneck, a 60-degree slope of bullet-hard ice, is suicide. One slip, and you fall 8,000 feet to the Godwin-Ostan Glacier. They were trapped. At 28,000 feet, you are not meant to stop. You are certainly not meant to sleep. But Marco and Gerard had no choice. They could not navigate the technical descent in the dark without lines. They had to bivouac. This is a polite word for freezing to death, slowly. They had no tents, no sleeping bags, and no stoves to melt snow for water. They were exposed to the open cosmos. Marco, drawing on his survival training, began to dig. He scraped shallow depressions into the snow, just enough to get them out of the biting wind. He screamed at Gerard to help, to keep moving, to generate heat. They huddled in these icy graves, their bodies pressed against the mountain, drifting in and out of consciousness. This is the realm of hallucinations. Climbers often report seeing phantom companions, hearing music, or feeling a warm, inviting sensation that is actually the final stage of hypothermia. Marco would later describe the night as an eternity of shivering, forcing himself to wiggle his toes, fighting the urge to close his eyes forever. Miraculously, the sun rose. The morning of August 2nd brought light, but it brought no warmth. They were alive, but they were wrecked. They were dehydrated, hypoxic, and their extremities were essentially blocks of wood. But the adrenaline of survival kicked in. They had to get down. Now, they crawled out of their snow holes, stiff and groggy. As they began to peer over the lip of the bottleneck, looking for a route down the ice, they saw a scene that would define the rest of their lives. Below them, tangled in a mess of severed ropes and debris, were 3 climbers from the Korean team. They had been swept by a smaller avalanche or had fallen during the night and become ensnared in the old lines. They were hanging precariously on the steep slope. Some were upside down, the blood rushing to their heads, rendering them delirious. This was the moment of divergence. This was the moment where the story splits into 2 versions, the one the world was told, and the one the mountain kept. Marco and Gerard climbed down to the tangled men. The scene was horrific. The Koreans Kim Jae-sugo Myung and another teammate were barely conscious. They were trapped in a bird's nest of rope, unable to free themselves. For over 3 hours, Marco and Ger worked. Imagine the physical cost of this. Every movement at 8,200 meters requires a Herculean effort. Your heart races just by standing up. Trying to untie frozen knots, lift heavy bodies, and secure anchors is work that would be exhausting at sea level. Up there, it is killing work. Marco later claimed that he gave everything he had. He described shouting at the men, pulling at the ropes, trying to revive them, but the situation was grim. The men were unresponsive or incoherent. Marco's oxygen was long gone. His feet were losing sensation. He felt the cold creeping toward his core. In Marco's mind, a calculation was made. It is a calculation that civilization judges harshly, but one that is common in the death zone. The triage of survival. He looked at the Koreans and saw the dead. He looked at himself and saw a man who was about to join them. He turned to Ger. According to Marco, he signaled that it was time to go. They had done what they could. Staying any longer meant dying with them. Marco began to descend the bottleneck unroped, kicking his crampons into the ice, focusing on every terrifying step. He thought Ger was right behind him. The fog had begun to roll in, obscuring visibility. Marco focused on his boots, on the ice, on the rhythm of survival. Kick, step, breathe. Kick, step, breathe. After a while, he stopped to rest and looked back up the slope, expecting to see the familiar yellow suit of his Irish friend descending toward him, but the slope was empty. Marco waited. He peered into the mist. Ger, he might have shouted, his voice swallowed by the wind. There was no movement, no answering shout, just the white silence of the bottleneck. Marco Confortola was alone. Why didn't Ger follow? Did he struggle with his crampons? Did he slip? Or did he look at the tangled men who were fathers, sons, friends and decide that he couldn't leave? Did the engineer in him see a solution to the knot that Marco had missed? Or did the man who had been saved by his own teammates 2 years ago simply refuse to break the chain of brotherhood? Marco turned back toward the descent. He was now fighting for his own life, descending into a delirium that would strip away his memory and leave him with a fragmented, haunting narrative. He told himself, Ger was gone. He told himself there was nothing left to do. But as Marco stumbled down toward Camp 4, a ghost was being born on the mountain behind him. Gerard McDonnell was still up there, and contrary to what Marco believed, he wasn't dead yet. In fact, he was about to do something extraordinary. Marco Confortola was a ghost walking. As he descended the bottleneck alone, the world narrowed down to the size of his boots. His body was cannibalizing itself. At this altitude, without supplemental oxygen, the brain begins to swell, pressing against the skull. This is high-altitude cerebral edema haze, and it brings with it a terrifying madness. Marco would later report hearing music, seeing lights that weren't there, and feeling an overwhelming urge to just sit down and sleep. But the survival instinct of the alpine guide kicked in. He forced himself down the traverse, stumbling, falling, and getting back up. When he finally collapsed into Camp 4, he was a wreck. His toes were black, frostbite had claimed them. His voice was a raspy whisper. When the rescuers and teammates asked him where Ger was, Marco's answer was grim and final. He told them Ger was gone. He told them that after their night in the open, Ger had fallen or stayed behind to die. In the chaotic haze of his own trauma, Marco constructed a reality that made sense to him. He had survived because he was strong. Ger had died because the mountain took him. The news broke instantly. Italian climber survives K2 disaster. Irish climber lost. The narrative was simple, tragic, and digestible. Marco was airlifted out, flown to hospitals where doctors would eventually amputate his toes. He gave press conferences from his hospital bed, his face gaunt, his eyes haunted. He spoke of the horror, of the trapped Koreans, of the cold. He painted a picture of a chaotic hellscape where nothing more could have been done. But while Marco was speaking to cameras and civilization, the mountain was revealing a different story to the Sherpas who were still in the death zone. Pemba Gyalje Sherpa, a man of immense strength and courage, had gone back up the mountain to search for survivors. He wasn't relying on memory or trauma-clouded haze. He was relying on what he saw, and what he saw contradicted Marco's story. Analysis of photographs taken by climbers high on the mountain, combined with the testimony of the few survivors who trickled down later, began to piece together the lost hours of Gerard McDonnell. When Marco turned his back and descended, Gerard McDonnell did not freeze. He did not give up, and he certainly didn't fall. Ger, the engineer, stayed with the tangled Koreans. He looked at the chaos of ropes, the bird's nest that had defeated the others, and he applied his mind. He realized that the tension on the ropes was pinning the men down. He couldn't untie the knots with his frozen fingers, and he couldn't cut the ropes without sending the men falling to their deaths. So, he did the only thing left. He climbed up. Witnesses below saw a lone figure in a red and black suit, Ger's suit, climbing back up the slope, above the trapped men. Why go up? To release the anchor. Ger climbed to the anchor point, adjusted the tension, and managed to introduce slack into the system. It worked. The 3 Korean climbers who had been hanging upside down, waiting for death, were suddenly released. They stood up. They were groggy, injured, and terrified, but they were free. Gerard McDonnell hadn't just comforted them, he had engineered their escape at 28,000 feet. after a night without shelter, entirely alone. This was the darker truth that later emerged. It wasn't dark because it was evil. It was dark because of the stark contrast it painted. Marco had left, believing the situation was hopeless. Ger had stayed and proved it wasn't. But K2 is a cruel storyteller. It does not reward heroism with safety. It was now the afternoon of August 2nd Ger, and the three Koreans began their descent. They were slow, moving like zombies, but they were moving. They had survived the night, the tangle, and the exposure. They were agonizingly close to Camp 4, where hot tea and oxygen waited. Below them, Pemba Gyalje and another Sherpa Tuzoring boat were climbing up to help. They saw the group coming down. Suring radioed base camp. I see them, I see 4 climbers. They are moving. Hope, for a brief shining moment, returned to K2. But the Serac, that massive hanging glacier that had started this nightmare, was not done. At roughly 10 a.m., a second massive section of the ice cliff collapsed. It didn't make a sound until it was too late. Thousands of tons of ice shattered and swept down the bottleneck. The avalanche was surgical in its cruelty. It missed the Sherpas below by mere yards, but it slammed directly into the group, descending from the traverse. In the blink of an eye, the rescue was over. The 3 Koreans were swept away into the void, and Gerard McDonnell, the man who had spent hours fighting for their lives, was taken with them. The radio went silent. The spot where they had been standing was now just a scour of white powder and fresh ice. When Marco Confortola was telling the world that Ger had died hours earlier, Ger was actually performing one of the greatest acts of altruism in mountaineering history. He was alive, working, and succeeding, right up until the very last second. This revelation changed everything. It transformed Marco's story from a tragic survival account into something more uncomfortable. It raised the question that haunts every survivor of a disaster. What if I had stayed? If Marco had stayed, would his extra strength have sped up the rescue? Could they have freed the men 20 minutes faster? And if they had been 20 minutes faster, would they have cleared the Serac before it fell? Or, if Marco had stayed, would there simply be 2 dead friends buried in the snow instead of 1? The evidence suggests that Marco didn't lie out of malice. He likely lied because his brain, broken by altitude and trauma, couldn't process the reality. Or perhaps, deep down, he couldn't face the fact that he walked away while his friends stayed to do the impossible. The lie was a shield. He needed to believe Ger was already dead to justify his own survival. But the mountain kept the receipts. The photos of the ropes, the testimony of the Sherpas, and the timeline established by radio calls proved that Gerard McDonnell was the hero of K2 that day. He was the first Irishman to summit K2, but his legacy wasn't the summit. It was the choice he made in the death zone. Marco descended to a life of frostbite, recovery, and a reputation forever shadowed by the events of August 2008. Ger stayed on the mountain. His body never recovered, entombing the secret of his final moments in the ice. As the years passed, the climbing community had to reconcile these 2 versions of the truth, the survivor's story and the hero's reality. It is a debate that still rages in alpine clubs and online forums. Was Marco a coward? No. He was a man pushing the limits of human physiology who made a rational decision to save his own life. Was Ger a saint? Perhaps. Or perhaps he was just a man who looked at a knot and couldn't walk away until he solved it. The tragedy of K2 in 2008 is not just about the falling ice. It is about the falling apart of human connection in the face of death. It is about the moment the rope is untied, and 2 friends, who stood together on top of the world, descend into 2 very different destinies. One to live with the ghosts, and one to become a legend. The snow covers everything eventually. It covers the bodies, the ropes, the footprints, and the lies. In the weeks and months following the 2008 K2 disaster, the media circus moved on. The satellite trucks left the Karakoram, the headlines faded from bold print to footnotes, and the world went back to its safe, oxygen-rich routine. But for the families left behind, and for the man who walked down alone, the mountain never really let go. Marco Confortola returned to Italy, a celebrated survivor, but he was a diminished man. The frostbite had taken his toes, claiming the very parts of him that had connected him to the earth. But the amputation of his story was far more painful. As the evidence mounted, the GPS data, the photos from the recovered cameras, the testimonies of the Sherpas, the narrative Marco had constructed began to crumble. It became clear that the version of events where Ger died instantly was a fabrication born of trauma, a psychological fortress built to protect a man from the unbearable guilt of being the one who lived. He wasn't a villain. It is too easy, from the comfort of our living rooms, to judge a man's morality when his brain was swelling and his blood was freezing. Marco Confortola was a human being pushed beyond the biological limits of existence. In the death zone, the line between reality and hallucination is as thin as the air. Perhaps he truly believed Ger was gone. Perhaps he had to believe it to take that next step down. Survival is a selfish act. It has to be. If you stop to care too much at 28,000 feet, you die. Marco chose life is a choice most of us would make, even if we refuse to admit it. But Gerard McDonnell made a different choice. And that is why his story endures. Ger's legacy is not that he climbed K2. Hundreds have done that. His legacy is that in a place that strips humanity down to its most primal, animalistic survival instincts, he remained profoundly human. He remained an engineer. He remained a friend. When faced with the tangled chaos of the Korean climbers, he didn't see a hopeless cause. He saw a problem to be solved. He didn't see dead men. He saw people who needed help. The irony is heartbreaking. The very trait that made Ger such a beloved figure, his empathy, his refusal to leave anyone behind, is exactly what killed him. If he had been more selfish, if he had been more professional in the cold, clinical sense of high-altitude guiding, he would likely be alive today. He would be an old man in Alaska, telling stories by a fire. But he wouldn't be Ger. You cannot separate the climber from the man. He died as he lived, helping others up. There is a haunting photograph taken on the summit that day. It shows Marco and Ger arms around each other, the curvature of the earth visible in the background. They look like conquerors. But looking at it now, it feels less like a victory photo and more like a farewell. It captures the last moment of innocence before the mountain demanded its price. One man would pay with his life. The other would pay with his peace. K2 remains indifferent. That is the true horror of the mountain. It is not malevolent. It is not the savage mountain because it hates us. It is savage because it doesn't know we exist. The serac that crushed Gerard McDonnell and the Koreans didn't fall because of fate or karma. It fell because gravity acted on ice. The wind that froze Marco's feet didn't blow to punish him. It just blew. We project our dramas, our heroes, and our villains onto these peaks. But the rock and the ice are silent. They reflect only what we bring to them. Marco Confortola continued to climb, though he would never be the same. He wrote books, he gave talks, he tried to explain the inexplicable. But in his eyes, in the pauses between his words, you can still see the shadow of the bottleneck. You can see the moment he turned his back. You can see the ghost of the friend who didn't follow. And what of the secret that haunts the mountain? The secret is not what happened to Ger. We know what happened. He was a hero. The secret is the question that whispers in the ear of every climber who looks up at that pyramid of ice. Who are you really? Stripped of your job, your money, your reputation, and your oxygen when the rope is cut and the darkness falls, are you the one who descends to save yourself, or are you the one who climbs back up into the trap to save a stranger? We all like to think we are Ger, but the survival instinct is a powerful, ancient voice. And until you are standing in the thin air, facing the void, you do not know the answer. Gerard McDonnell answered that question with his life. He proved that even at the edge of death, where the laws of man usually dissolve, compassion can survive. He didn't just climb the mountain, he elevated the standard of what it means to be a mountaineer. This has been the story of the 2008 K2 tragedy, a story of two friends, one summit, and two very different paths down. If you want to explore more of the untold, gritty, and often terrifying history of the world's highest peaks, you need to subscribe to K2 Stories. We are building a community of people who respect the altitude and the truth. We dig into the archives, the logs, and the silence to bring you the stories that others miss. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are just getting started, and now, I leave you with this. Put yourself in the boots of Marco Confortola. You are freezing, hallucinating, and dying. You look back, and your friend is gone. You look down, and safety is miles away. Do you turn around and climb back up into the death zone on a hunch, or do you take the step toward life? If you were on that rope, would you have chosen the glory of the martyr, or the burden of the survivor? Let me know your honest answer in the comments below. Stay bold, climb safe, and I'll see you in the next one.